Athena Strand was born on May 25, 2015 in the small town of Duncan, Oklahoma. Soon after, Athena's parents got divorced and her father moved to Texas, leaving Athena with her mother. Although he was far away, he stayed in touch with his daughter and visited her whenever he could. On occasion, Athena's mother would organize time for Athena to spend with her father. Even though they were separated, their bond remained strong. Athena's mother made certain that Athena spent as much time as possible with her father. Over time, Athena's mother got remarried and her father also found a new spouse. The girl had 2 younger sisters whom she grew very close to, and she made an effort to give them plenty of attention. At the end of 2022, 7-year-old Athena went to live with her dad in Texas until the New Year's break. Afterwards, she had to return to her mom in Oklahoma. During this period, Athena attended the nearby elementary school, made friends with her classmates, and adapted to the school's rhythm. Her dad's home was located amidst forests and vast fields. It was a great experience for the girl to spend time outside, discover the area, and of course, enjoy the close company of her father. Her father met his new partner, Elizabeth, and to their amazement, Athena and Elizabeth quickly connected. They did several fun activities together, spent time with each other, and even became friends. On November 30th, the girl came home from school on the bus at around 4:15 in the afternoon, as usual. Her father and grandfather were out hunting, leaving Athena under Elizabeth's supervision. An argument ensued between Athena and Elizabeth, which escalated into a heated dispute, eventually causing Athena to take offense and retreat to her room. To appease Athena, Elizabeth went to the kitchen to prepare dinner for her. About 20 minutes had passed when Elizabeth chose to invite Athena to dinner, but she couldn't find her. However, they hadn't seen the girl either. Elizabeth felt anxious. She searched the whole house and the yard, but Athena was nowhere to be seen. So, Elizabeth called her husband's relatives who lived just a few hundred meters away because sometimes Athena visited them. After, Elizabeth called her husband and cried as she explained what happened. He told her to call the police right away and went to the house. The woman called 911 at 6:40 p.m. and the police arrived 14 minutes later. Elizabeth explained what had happened and shared her thoughts. She believed that the argument between her and Athena may have led the girl to run away. However, some of Athena's family members disagreed. They pointed out that Athena is only 7 years old and had never left home before. Additionally, it was getting dark outside, and the little girl was scared of the night. Police officers were unsure of Elizabeth at first because she hadn't contacted them until 40 minutes after the girl went missing. But, after speaking with her and going over all the details, they believed her story was most likely accurate. The officers started looking right away. Even though it was already nighttime, they searched the nearby woods and fields within a few miles of the house. The police worked hard to scan the entire area. They thought that Athena might have left the house and gotten lost after dark. They also checked for signs of kidnapping, but didn't find any clues. Elizabeth didn't hear any loud sounds or screams. None of her neighbors witnessed anything suspicious that night. Both relatives of the missing girl and other concerned residents assisted the police in their search. Athena's mother went searching for her daughter as soon as she found out about her disappearance. The search went on until almost 5 in the morning but turned up no trace of Athena. The situation was made harder by the area surrounding the house being hard to reach, especially at night. At 7 a.m., the police began another big search for the little girl. More officers were called in to help with the search. Lots of people in the neighborhood were very upset about the missing child and hundreds of volunteers went to help with the search. Some people looked for her on horses and ATVs, while the police used drones and helicopters with thermal imaging cameras to get a better view of the area. Unfortunately, even though everyone tried very hard all day, they couldn't find Athena. Worry and unease mounted among the police as they feared for the girl's safety, especially as it was the start of winter. This was particularly concerning since it was the beginning of winter and temperatures were dropping to the tens of degrees, even in Texas where winters are generally mild. Athena was dressed in light clothing and it seemed highly unlikely for her to survive in such conditions. On the third day, the search continued. The police expanded their search area to 6 miles around the house and called in their colleagues for assistance. They searched for a potential criminal connection in the case. Despite not having any initial evidence, the police suspected that Athena had been abducted from home. They searched for her in all directions for several days, but she was never found. It seemed highly unlikely that she could have traveled such a far distance alone and not encountered any community. The detectives also looked for individuals who might have been in the vicinity of Athena's house that evening. This was challenging because the house was encircled by trees and the road was far away. Also, there were no security cameras nearby. But eventually, a lead surfaced. A courier delivered a parcel to Athena's location overnight. Investigators promptly spoke with FedEx, who confirmed that an external contractor had made the delivery. After contacting the delivery company, they were able to determine which truck visited Athena's home that evening. These trucks had cameras installed, and immediately, they asked for the November 30th video. Upon reviewing it, investigators discovered distressing footage of the driver pulling a girl who closely resembled Athena into the vehicle. They promptly identified the driver from the company's records and went to his address. The man identified himself as Tanner Corner, a 31-year-old. Suspicions of kidnapping quickly arose and he was detained for interrogation. Upon mentioning the surveillance video, Horner immediately confessed. He acknowledged delivering a package to Athena's residence on the night in question. As the man backed up his truck, he felt a jolt and stepped out to check what had happened. Horner discovered a girl on the ground and realized he had accidentally hit her. As he approached, he saw that she wasn't hurt badly, was awake, not crying, and even spoke to him. The girl told him that she would inform her father about the accident, and the man became anxious. He then took the girl into his truck. While figuring out how to solve the problem, she kept talking to him and introduced herself as Athena. Horner didn't know what to do with the situation. He knew that if the girl told the truth to the adults, he would break the law. He surprisingly decided to tell the investigators the truth of what happened. Their reaction was very surprising. Horner said he didn't have any other options besides murder. He even confessed that he first tried to break her neck, but it didn't work. Then he resorted to strangulation as a gruesome solution. Afterwards, he removed the body and discarded it into the river in a neighboring town. This account garnered many inquiries from the police. Nevertheless, the suspect offered them the exact coordinates where he left Athena's body. The investigators promptly journeyed to the location and, to their horror, discovered her inert body there. The murder of the girl shocked many people, not just her family. News of the crime was covered by major media outlets, and the brutality of the act appalled the nation. Horner was charged with kidnapping and murder, and while waiting for the medical examiner's report, detectives focused on uncovering the perpetrator's identity and motive. Horner's explanation of his actions was completely unbelievable. He said he hit the girl with his van, but she wasn't hurt badly. He was scared, though, and decided to kill her because he could get fired from his job for hitting a child even if she wasn't injured. Horner's story was really strange. The police discovered that he was going to get married and had a child a year before the events. In addition to delivering packages, he sometimes worked at Uber part-time. Horner was also interested in music. He played in a band that performed at various cafes in the nearby city of Fort Worth. On social media, he posted many photos of his child, videos from his musical performances, and other things that don't make him look like a monster. Before he was arrested, he had not had any trouble with the law. The police couldn't find any evidence in his entire life story that suggests he is a ruthless killer. Just 2 months before Athena's death, the man posted pictures of himself spending time with his son and grandparents. The medical examiner's report, which was expected to clarify what happened, took several weeks. Meanwhile, Athena's parents filed a lawsuit against FedEx and the contracting company, accusing them of letting Horner work. They requested stricter employee screening and selection standards to prevent future similar offenses. One soon learned a fact that made the entire tale sadder. Horner had been delivering a Christmas present for Athena that night. Her parents had placed an order for a Barbie doll that she had desired for a long time. The medical examiner's report unveiled additional inquiries in the matter. As per the document, the victim met their demise within the initial hour of the abduction. They found injuries of different levels of seriousness on her body, and the reason for her death was strangulation. However, the detectives' primary hypothesis was not validated. They reasoned that Horner saw the girl outside of the house and chose to take her. Medical examiners discovered no indication of sexual assault to maltreat her. This perplexed the police since it was the most apparent motive. None of them were certain if the killer's story portrayed the events accurately, as there was no logical explanation. Investigators speculated that the criminal intended to harm the girl, but the plan had failed. Athena had gone outside, into the yard, after having a disagreement with her father's spouse. Horner arrived at the home to deliver a package and noticed the girl. The researchers believe he viewed it as a chance to fulfill his twisted desires. Athena stood by herself outside the house, which was surrounded by trees and blocked from view. It's unclear if Horner convinced her to get into the van or if he forcefully put her in the vehicle. The details of what occurred next are not known. The two main ideas that appear plausible are that Horner intended to take the girl from her home and commit the heinous act, but when she began to scream or flee, he panicked and murdered her. He then disposed of her body in the river. Alternatively, according to the second theory, Horner may have performed some immoral actions on the victim that didn't require physical touching, making it difficult for medical examiners to determine if sexual assault occurred. Soon detectives had indirect and unexpected evidence that the offense may have had a sexual motivation. Horner did not have any legal issues before committing this murder, which is uncommon. Usually, individuals who intentionally end another person's life begin with lesser crimes. Detectives conducted a comprehensive background investigation on Horner for several weeks. They interviewed his family, friends, and acquaintances, seeking any indications of Horner's potential involvement in other crimes. They eventually made a breakthrough. The police found some individuals who claimed that they were mistreated by Horner when they were children. The police kept their identities as well as all incident details confidential for investigative purposes. All that is known is that one of the victims accused Horner of abusing her 9 years earlier. Horner was charged with 3 other incidents of child abuse in 2013. It's currently unclear if the case involves one child or 3 separate victims. Additionally, one of Horner's victims had spoken publicly for years about being abused by a man when she was 16. This girl had posted about it on her social media accounts for years, attempting to make people aware of the fact that Horner was a dangerous criminal. For some unknown reason, the man has not faced punishment for his actions or even been considered a suspect. The girl who said he committed the crime wrote that nobody believed her for many years. But when Horner killed Athena, these accusations got more attention, showing the man's true nature and why he might have done it. Horner will now face trial for these accusations too, but it will be separate from the Athena murder trial. Note another important aspect, which may seem trivial on its own, but in light of Horner's overall criminal behavior offers further understanding of his true character. Once his identity became public, online users uncovered the killer's TikTok profile. Though only a handful of videos were posted, the most recent, uploaded just a few weeks before the murder, proved the most intriguing. In this video, Horner recorded his reaction to a clip of a man trapping a bug in a glass and then slowly poisoning it with a canister. As the bug died, Horner exhibited a creepy expression on his face, as if he enjoyed the killing process. If the man was indeed a sadist who derived pleasure from watching someone die, his version of Athena's murder is once again called into question. Horner said he only killed her because he was afraid of getting punished for a smaller crime. But if he truly had those cruel desires, his explanation sounds even more ridiculous. The authorities announced that they'll seek the death penalty when the trial begins. Horner got his own lawyer, who suggested that he take back his confession and plead not guilty. However, it's doubtful that this will save him from receiving the punishment. Since the police have video from the van and Horner's testimony pinpointing the body's exact location, it is evident that he is guilty. Furthermore, undisclosed evidence may become public during the trial. There is a possibility that the van contains traces of Athena's DNA, and with her clothing and body, could have collected the killer's genetic material. We simply need to wait for more information to be revealed to the public regarding the trial. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Connie DeBate was born on July 31, 1976 in the small town of Ellington, Connecticut. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother. Since childhood, Connie showed kindness and a desire to help people, so she had many friends. It was these qualities that inspired her to pursue a career in medicine. After graduating from the University of Connecticut, she began working in sales for a pharmaceutical company. In addition, Connie became vice president of a nonprofit organization in her town that provided free emergency medical care to the public. In the early 2000s, Connie had the opportunity to fulfill her dream of having a large, close-knit family. Connie met Richard and they loved each other. The couple married on July 4, 2003, and their first son was born soon after. 3 years later, the family welcomed a second baby boy. At the same time, Connie and Richard decided to buy a new home and purchased a spacious home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington. The location was perfect for their large family. The new home had spacious rooms and the backyard had plenty of room for the kids to play. They enjoyed spending time with friends who also lived in the neighborhood. For years they had led a prosperous life, but on December 23, 2015, a terrible thing happened. On the morning of that day, the police department received 2 calls. First, a security company called to report that an alarm had gone off at Richard and Connie's home. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police and asked for help. Officers immediately arrived at the house where a horrific scene awaited them. One of the police officers entered through the open front door and immediately found a trail of blood leading from the basement stairs toward the kitchen. He followed the trail into the kitchen, where he discovered Richard. The man was partially bound with clamps to an overturned chair and was lying face down. There were visible wounds on his body and he had another plastic screed around his neck. A police officer called his name and Richard responded with one phrase, "He's still in the house." The police officers immediately requested additional forces and began to search both the house itself and the entire neighborhood. Immediately afterward, another gruesome discovery awaited them. When they went down to the basement, they saw Connie's body with a gun lying next to it. The detectives untied Richard, and while they waited for an ambulance, he told them what had happened that morning. Around 8:10 a.m., he drove his sons to the bus stop where they went to school, and Richard returned home. He changed into his office clothes, got in his car and drove to work. Meanwhile, Connie was getting ready for a gym class at a local charity organization. Shortly after Richard left the house, he received a notice from the security company that the alarm had gone off at his house. This was not the first time this had happened, and the cause was usually their cat, which they had left home alone. The man also realized that he had forgotten his laptop, which he needed for work, and decided to return home. Before turning back, he sent a text message to his boss that he would be late. Between 8:45 and 9:00 a.m., Richard returned to the house. When he entered the house, he heard a strange noise coming from the second floor. Cautiously, he went upstairs and entered the bedroom, where he found an unfamiliar man rummaging through the closet. Richard noticed that the perpetrator was dressed in camouflage clothing and his face was covered. As soon as the stranger saw Richard, he pounced on him and knocked him to the floor. He then demanded that he give him his wallet, bank cards and their PIN numbers. Otherwise, he threatened that he would wait for Richard's family to return and kill them. Suddenly, Richard heard the garage door open. Apparently Connie had returned early. Richard shouted, warning that someone was in the house, and ordered her to run away. The stranger headed down the stairs, but Richard tried to stop him. But the perpetrator threw Richard down the stairs and he fell to the first floor. While he was regaining consciousness, Connie ran down the stairs to the basement where the 2 guns were kept, and the criminal ran after her. Richard got up and went to the basement. There he found that the unknown man was already holding a gun, and the next second he shot Connie. The loud sound of the shot almost deafened Richard for a few minutes. He thought a second shot sounded soon after, but he wasn't sure. The killer sat Richard down in a chair and tied his hands and feet with plastic ties. He then put the gun away, took a pair of wire cutters that were in the basement, and stabbed the man several times in the body. John Doe then threw several items on the floor, took a blowtorch and began burning them in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. He then turned to Richard and pointed the blowtorch at him. Richard, who was partially tied to a chair, was able to get up and knock the blowtorch out of his attacker's hands. Richard grabbed the blowtorch and pointed it at the perpetrator, igniting the mask on his face. The perpetrator, who was unarmed, immediately ran out of the basement. Richard immediately went upstairs to call the police. As the man recounted what had happened, the police searched the house and surrounding area for several miles, but were unable to locate the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet on the front lawn. In order to find traces of the killer, the investigators called in cinematologists with search dogs. The dogs sniffed the wallet because the killer had previously held it in his hands. However, this attempt was unsuccessful. All three dogs kept bringing the detectives back to Richard. The detectives then led the dogs through the house, hoping to pick up the intruder's scent, but this too was unsuccessful. This behavior puzzled the detectives because normally trained dogs are able to detect signs of human presence even after several days. However, in this case, none of the three dogs smelled anything. Investigators also found something strange in Richard's story. According to Richard, about 5 minutes elapsed between the time he entered the house and the time the perpetrator fled. Given that Richard got home between 8:40 and 900, it should have been over by 905 at the latest. However, the security company didn't report the house alarm going off until 10:16, and Richard himself called the police shortly thereafter. It turns out that he spent more than an hour in the house before calling for help. In addition, there was too little time between Connie's departure for training and her return home. Richard was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed that his injuries were not life-threatening. At the hospital, detectives interviewed him again in hopes of getting a description of his attacker. Richard reported that the assailant was tall and large, but his face was obscured by the mask. Medical examiners conducted a detailed examination of Connie's body and confirmed that she had suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one in the abdomen and one in the back of the head. The detectives were stumped and continued to question Richard, hoping to get more information. But the more questions they asked, the more suspicious his answers became. Initially, the man claimed he left the house to go to work while Connie was getting ready for a workout. But at the hospital, he said he couldn't remember which one of them left first. It was also unclear to him whether the alarm had been set before he left or whether his wife had set it off. Richard also changed his version of events. First, he claimed he heard a noise on the second floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he says there was no noise and that he only noticed the perpetrator after he went upstairs and into the bedroom. The man also claimed that the perpetrator did not push him down the second floor stairs, but that he himself tripped and fell. The main contradiction, however, was the timing of the murder. Richard said he ran to the basement and saw the assailant take the gun from Connie before shooting her. However, he initially said he did not know how the assailant got the gun. In addition, the man said it was pitch black in the basement and detectives wondered how he could have seen what was happening. Richard also added that he couldn't see Connie's body because of the darkness, so he wasn't sure if his wife was dead. Another point of suspicion was Richard's wounds. They were all superficial and not threatening, but the interesting thing was that most of them were on the left side of his torso. Since the man was right-handed, and it was his right hand that was not tied to the chair, he could have inflicted these wounds on himself. In addition, there were no bruises or contusions on his body. According to Richard's testimony, he struggled with the perpetrator and fell down the stairs and should have had abrasions. However, not the slightest trace of these was found. There were traces of blood on Richard's shorts, but again there were inconsistencies with his version of events. If Richard had been injured by a sharp object while sitting in the chair, there should have been at least a few drops of blood on the bottom of his shorts. But there were no marks. The same goes for the spot in the basement where the killer stabbed Richard with the wire cutters. There should have been a lot of blood on the floor where the chair stood, but the forensic experts found only a few small drops. But that's not all. According to Richard, after the criminal fled, he came to for some time and then crawled up the stairs and from the basement to the first floor. However, there was no trace of blood on the stairs, even though the man was wounded and should have been bleeding. Another strange detail caught the detectives' attention. While investigating the crime scene, they noticed that the basement window was open. The police admitted that the killer could have entered the house through it, but there was one interesting point: the locks had been removed from the window, and from the inside. They had also been removed from the other window. To test the hypothesis, the investigators decided to try a little experiment. They tried to open the window from the outside, but they succeeded only after one of the policemen hit the frame, knocking it out and breaking the glass. This fact was the reason for the detectives' doubt that the criminal could have opened the window without locks and without the breakage of the glass. All of these circumstances led the detectives to believe that the story Richard told them might have been fabricated. Consequently, they decided to visit Richard again in the hospital and question him about possible problems in his marriage to Connie. In response, the man admitted that he had a mistress, but that Connie was aware of the situation. Based on his story, Richard claimed that he and his wife had decided to have a third child, but Connie could not get pregnant. As a result, Richard suggested the option of surrogacy, and they chose his former classmate, Rita, as a potential surrogate. Rita was recently divorced and wanted to have a child. Richard and his wife proposed the following plan to Rita: she would be the mother of Richard's child, and then they would raise the child as a threesome. Rita agreed to the proposal. They originally planned to use the medical method of fertilization, but it turned out to be too expensive. So they decided to use a more natural method, and Richard became intimate with Rita, after which she became pregnant. Richard claimed that Connie was completely on board and supported their decision. However, detectives had strong doubts about the veracity of this story, as it sounded unusual and questionable. Under pressure from the police officers, Richard changed his story about Rita. A few minutes after the previous story, he suddenly stated that in fact Connie and his former classmate had never seen each other or even communicated. He also mentioned that he wasn't sure if his wife knew about Rita's pregnancy. As his interview with the police continued, he finally admitted that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years and that Connie was completely unaware of what was going on. Investigators contacted the woman. Rita stated that she began a romantic relationship with Richard less than a year ago. She knew he was married, but he claimed he was in the process of divorcing. The woman found out she was pregnant in June, 6 months before the incident. Richard claimed he had already hired a divorce attorney and intended to finalize the process by the time the baby was born. However, the investigation revealed that Richard had not actually contacted an attorney. In addition, everyone Connie knew claimed that she had never mentioned the divorce. All of this led detectives to consider Richard as a prime suspect. But so far, no significant evidence had been found against him, and the police began to investigate. During this investigation, they discovered some interesting facts. Close friends and relatives of the family reported that Connie often complained about the contractor, with whom they had serious problems. The work on their home had been done poorly, and the couple had tried to get some of their money back, but the contractor had been aggressive. Connie admitted that she was seriously concerned about the situation, and together with Richard, they purchased 2 guns and installed an alarm system. Investigators checked out the suspected contractor, but he had an alibi for the time of the crime. As a result of the investigation, they came back to the only suspect, Richard. For many months, the police did not reveal their suspicions about Richard as a potential murderer. All of Connie's acquaintances and relatives believed that an unknown burglar was behind the crime and sympathized with Richard. The detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that Connie would definitely tell them about her husband's infidelity, especially if he had a pregnant mistress. Other family acquaintances noticed that Richard began acting strangely after his wife's death. He didn't seem depressed or upset, and just a few days after the incident, he approached several neighbors and asked, "Where do you usually order food?" The police found out that Connie and Richard were in serious financial trouble. However, Connie did not know where her money was going, while Richard was secretly spending it on his mistress. A note titled, "Why I Want a Divorce," was found on Connie's smartphone. In the note, the woman said that Richard was constantly lying, abusing her and the children, spending her money without permission, and so on. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie herself had considered ending the marriage. But she had no idea about her husband's secret life. Upon closer examination of the financial side of the case, police discovered that just 5 days after the murder, Richard attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account, but his request was denied by security. A month later, he also received a check for $75,000 from his wife's employer. These facts suggested possible self-serving motives on Richard's part, but they were not sufficient to prove his guilt. Curiously, Richard terminated his contract with the security company just 19 days after the murder. If his story about the killer's attack was true, such a move would have been illogical, as he would have put himself and his sons in danger without proper protection. Investigators got a warrant to look at all the electronics in Connie's house. And they finally found something significant. By piecing together all the information, police were able to reconstruct the exact timeline of events. At 8:44 a.m., the security system detected the garage door opening and closing. From the events that followed, investigators determined that at 8:53 a.m. that same day, Connie was captured on camera near the gym, indicating that she had gone to work out. At 8:50, Richard, who was home at the time, turned the alarm off and then turned it back on. Then, at 8:59, the man used a remote control to disable the alarm system again. Since the remote works a short distance from the system, Richard must have returned home. This is consistent with his claim that he returned to get the laptop. There was one problem. However, Richard claimed that he received a notification from the alarm on his way to work, but at that time the security system was not recording a breach, meaning that he did not receive a notification. At 9:02 a.m., Richard logged into his email from his tablet, and 2 minutes later, he texted his boss that he was going to be late because his alarm had gone off. Here is another inconsistency. Not only was there no actual notification of the alarm, but Richard also lied about sending the letter to the police. He said he sent the letter as soon as he received the notification, a few miles from home. But data from the tablet showed that he was at home when he sent the letter, because it was connected to the home's Wi-Fi. It appeared that the man had spent at least 4 minutes in the house before discovering the burglar, and everything that happened next took less than a minute, which was considered impossible. But the most important piece of evidence were the readings from Connie's fitness bracelet. She arrived at the gym at 8:53 a.m., but left after a few minutes because the class was cancelled at 9:08 a.m. The wristband stopped tracking her steps, leading investigators to conclude that Connie got in her car and drove home. The drive took 8 minutes, and that is when the fun began. According to Richard, the killer attacked his wife almost immediately after she entered the house, but the bracelet's data contradicted that. The woman walked 370 meters into her home between 9:18 and 10:17. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes. In this time frame, it appears that Connie entered the house at 9:18 and was alive for almost a full hour, which was completely inconsistent with her husband's story. The important factor here was that the police were not just dealing with theoretical inconsistencies, but with actual digital evidence. It took the police more than a year to gather this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event came as a real shock. They had no idea what evidence the police had gathered and continued to see Richard as a victim. The man was charged with murder and initially wanted to set bail at $5 million, but his lawyer insisted that Richard had a clean criminal record and 2 minor sons in his care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million and he immediately posted the money. Richard spent 5 years waiting for the trial to begin, as it was constantly postponed. It began only in April 2022, and during this time the man's lawyers managed to collect many interesting facts. The defense presented evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. They also pointed out that a very small amount of gunpowder was found on Richard's hands. If he was the person who shot Connie, there should have been a lot more. The prosecution refuted these arguments. The gunpowder sample was taken several hours after the man was taken to the hospital. In that time, Richard could have erased most of the evidence. As for the DNA, there was no evidence that it belonged specifically to the mystery killer. These samples could have been left by anyone who visited Richard and Connie's home at least once. In return, the prosecution presented a detailed digital map of the couple's movements that morning, which absolutely refuted all of Richard's statements. Evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unknown intruder. Up until that point, she had been moving around the house and using social media as if nothing had happened. Richard's story itself also became a powerful argument for the prosecution, as the man repeatedly changed his story, and all the contradictions in his words were used as further evidence of the falsity of his stories. The trial lasted 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but he continued to maintain his innocence. This trial was an ordeal for Connie's family and friends, who only learned of all the evidence against her husband during the trial itself. Until then, many of them continued to believe in the story of an unknown robber, but after all the cards were on the table, no one doubted Richard's guilt. Nevertheless, the man's lawyers have announced plans to appeal the verdict until it is reconsidered, but so far all these attempts have not brought them the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they were sent to live with their mother's relatives. They were 6 and 9 years old at the time of the murder, but the children lived with their father until the sentencing. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. I also recommend subscribing to our channel where we publish the most interesting crime stories from around the world. Thanks for watching. Jill Ma was born on October 30, 1982 in a small town in Ireland. Her childhood was spent in the village of Termon Pecan. When she was 9 years old, the family moved to Perth, Australia, where her father got a job. There, Jill finished school and returned to Ireland in 1996. After returning, Jill attended Drogheda Gymnasium and St. Oliver's Community College before earning a Bachelor of Arts degree from University College Dublin. After graduating, Jill took a job with a major broadcasting company. That's when she met Tom Ma, whom she married in 2008. A year later, they decided to move to Melbourne, Australia. There, Jill got a job as an administrator at a radio station and occasionally appeared on the air. On the evening of September 21, 2012, Jill and her colleagues decided to visit the Brunswick Green Bar on Sydney Road. After a busy evening, the company decided to take a walk and check out another bar on the same street. Around 1:30 a.m., Jill left the bar and headed home to her husband's house. On the way, she called her brother Michael to discuss her father's health, who was ill. Jill's concern was obvious, and her brother decided to get the whole family together for the upcoming holidays. Around 2 a.m., Tom, Jill's husband, woke up and realized she still hadn't come home. He became worried. Tom called her cell phone, but Jill didn't answer. He went in search of her. Tom walked all the streets and didn't find her. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Tom decided to call the police. The cops went around the neighborhood interviewing random passers-by, but no one had seen Jill. Her co-workers, with whom she had spent the evening, told the cops that they had last seen her leaving a bar on Sydney Road. They said goodbye to her, assuming she would return home soon. In the morning, the police combed the town thoroughly but found no evidence. In the morning, Jill's co-workers decided to use social media to intensify the search. They tweeted about her disappearance and created a Facebook group called Help Us Find Jill Ma. The news of her disappearance quickly attracted media attention. Flyers were posted everywhere in Melbourne with information about the missing woman. As a result, public attention to the case skyrocketed and thousands of people followed Jill's fate from day one. Tom gave an emotional speech to the reporters, which drew even more attention to the case. On the same day, police officers began a thorough analysis of the video recordings from street surveillance cameras. They examined hundreds of minutes of footage taken at various locations around the city in stores, at intersections, at gas stations. There was only one tape in their possession that captured Jill. This footage was taken by a camera located near the bar where she said goodbye to her friends and headed toward her home. Police officers scrutinized each frame, looking at the surroundings and possible clues that could help in the investigation. They carefully compared the video footage with other footage, trying to identify additional details and possible witnesses. This phase of police work was an important step in the search for Jill. On September 24, a street search led to the first lead. Jill's bag was found in one of the alleys near her home. This find helped police focus on a specific neighborhood. On September 5, police found Jill in one of the videos outside a bridal store at 1:42 a.m. The footage was recorded 12 minutes after she left the bar. The video shows her talking to a suspicious man wearing a blue hoodie in the middle of the street. The same man was filmed outside the store 4 minutes earlier. One of the recordings shows him running in the same direction as Jill. Police also tracked the geolocation of Jill's phone and found that it was traveling on a major thoroughfare in Melbourne that evening. This indicated that the phone was in the vehicle. Law enforcement began reviewing camera footage from cameras on that highway. Thanks to the phone's geolocation data, they were able to rule out many cars passing through there that night. Given the time and route of the phone, they quickly determined that its movement matched the route of one of the vehicles. When police checked the license plate number of that vehicle, they were shocked it was registered to an offender with a criminal record for violent acts against several women. On September 27, police announced the arrest of 41-year-old Adrian Ernest Bailey. According to police, he abused Jill Ma and took her life. Despite the fact that the police did not disclose details, no one hoped that Jill could be found alive. In a private briefing for journalists, the police only stated that they were confident of solving the case. As soon as the name of the suspect was announced to journalists, the biography of Adrian Ernest Bailey became the subject of intense scrutiny. Adrian Bailey worked in a candy store and had 4 kids by 2 different women. He got married when he was 18 because his girlfriend was expecting a baby. Later, the couple had another child but split up after 6 years. Shockingly, Adrian faced charges of mistreating his girlfriend and 2 attempted assaults on others when he was just 19 years old, leading him to prison. He got a 5-year prison sentence but only served 22 months after being released on parole. Adrian remarried in 1995 and had a son and daughter this time. However, he was accused of violence again in 2000, but the court couldn't prove him guilty. A few years after that, he was imprisoned for 11 years following his conviction for victimizing 5 girls. After Bailey was arrested for Jill's murder, police questioned him for hours until he finally confessed. He said he killed Jill Ma in a dark alley on Hop Street and then led the police to where he hid her body. The location was in the Black Hill Street neighborhood, on the outskirts of Melbourne. He claimed he saw Jill outside a bridal salon and attempted to kiss her, but she hit him. He brought her to a dark alley and committed heinous acts, ultimately ending her life. Afterwards, he became extremely scared and cried. He drove back home, but then returned to the crime scene with a shovel. He buried Jill's body on Black Hill Street. During the arrest, the police found out that Bailey was on parole when he committed the crime and should have been monitored. This caused outrage among the public as the judicial system failed to prevent a dangerous criminal from being released. To honor Jill Ma's memory, a procession was held on Sydney Road, which turned out to be much bigger than expected. On that day, 30,000 worried Melbourne residents marched. This demonstrates how deeply Jill's tragic fate affected people and received extensive community backing. Jill's folks, also in attendance, conveyed thanks to all present and aspire that this awful incident will compel the authorities to prioritize women's street safety. Jill Ma's funeral was held on October 4 in a private ceremony. Given the enormous attention to this story, thousands of people could attend the ceremony, and the family wanted to bid her farewell in silence. Bailey's trial started on April 5, 2013. Everyone assumed he would deny his guilt and try to avoid punishment. However, during the first hearing, he completely confessed his guilt. The last hearing was on June 19, where the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. Bailey may have the possibility of parole after 35 years at the earliest. 3 investigations led to Bailey being found guilty of several more violent crimes against 3 women by March 2015. He did all these crimes before attacking Jill Ma, but only after the case was made public did the victims report to the police. The court gave Bailey an 18-year prison sentence in May 2015. He may be eligible for parole after serving 43 years. Even though his lawyers were successful in challenging one of his previous offense charges, Bailey cannot apply for parole until he reaches 80 years old. After the trial, new information about Bailey's life was revealed. According to the offender, Bailey experienced abuse from an adult woman when he was a child, and his father frequently resorted to physical punishment. Additionally, Bailey has been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which causes extreme mood swings and difficulty controlling anger. The court did not consider these factors and did not decrease Bailey's jail term. In November 2020, Bailey's mother gave an astonishing statement in an interview. She said that she reached out to the police multiple times to alert them about her son's dangerous behavior. However, the police completely ignored her and disregarded her attempts to bring attention to Bailey's threat. This caused a public uproar and raised concerns about a system that failed to safeguard society from a potentially violent man. After everything that happened, the Victorian officials made the parole laws stricter. This incident made it clear to all Australians that the system can be unjust. These changes made it possible for an offender to go back to jail for minor violations and much harder to get out early. Even the prominent politicians acknowledged their failure to help Jill Ma. Share your opinion on this story in the comments. Fawn Cox was born in Kansas City, Missouri on March 24, 1973. Her parents soon had 2 other daughters. The family lived in a small 2-story house in a poor bedroom community. From an early age, she helped her parents care for the younger children, attended church regularly, and had a passion for swimming. When she turned 16, Fawn got a part-time job at a local amusement park. Her family lived quite poorly, and the girl tried to earn some money in her spare time. She spent most of the summer vacation of 1989 working. Mostly, the girl stood behind the cash register and sold tickets for the rides. On Wednesday, July 26, she finished her shift. Around 10 p.m., her mother and younger sister picked her up by car, as it would have taken a long time to get home from the park by public transportation. Almost immediately after returning home, Fawn went to bed because she had to go back to work the next morning. The girl slept on the 2nd floor. She had a separate room. The next room was usually where her sisters slept, but that night she was alone on the floor. Her sister Amber, only a year younger, was babysitting for a family she knew that night. Her other sister, Felicia, decided to sleep on the 1st floor because it was much cooler there. It was a very hot night and the only air conditioner that worked was downstairs. Her parents also slept on the 1st floor. The next morning, around 9 a.m., the whole family woke up to the sound of the alarm clock in Fawn's room, but for some reason, the girl did not turn it off. Her sister and mother went to her room, where an eerie sight awaited them. Fawn was lying on the bed, showing no signs of life, and there were visible bruises on the back of her neck. The girl also did not have a pulse, and her parents immediately called for an ambulance, but they were unable to do anything to help her. It was obvious that Fawn had died several hours earlier. After examining her body, medical experts determined that the cause of death was strangulation. The girl had also been subjected to violence. The police realized that they were facing a very difficult investigation from the very first hours. Her parents and sister had heard absolutely nothing, even though Fawn had been killed in her room in a small house with very poor soundproofing. But there was an explanation. The air conditioner on the 1st floor was old and working very loudly, blocking out all other noise in the house. The only oddity that night was noticed by Fawn's sister. Their dog was acting anxious and barking, but they didn't pay much attention. This behavior was attributed to the fact that the dog was pregnant. Police made several important discoveries after investigating the crime scene. Their theory is that the assailants, or a group of assailants, entered the house through a 2nd-story window with a view of the backyard. An old trailer was parked in front of the house. It could easily have been used to climb up to the outbuilding's visor, which was almost level with the window. The window itself was left open. In Fawn's room, experts found the first important clues: some short hairs, small bloodstains, and semen on her bedsheet. All of this was sent to the lab for analysis. Several items, including radios, a Nintendo game console, and a stereo recorder, were also missing from the house. Several other items were found on the ground in front of the house. It looked as if the burglar had thrown them out of the window to take them, but for some reason left them there. The detectives also discovered that a number of items had been taken from a closet in a room next door on the 2nd floor. They believe the killer hid in this cupboard and waited until everyone in the house fell asleep. The Fawn sisters usually slept in that room, but not that night. That's why no one noticed the missing items. The police found another strange piece of evidence. An old army cap was found in Fawn's room. All of Fawn's relatives said they had never seen this item on the girl. So detectives thought the killer might have left the cap at the scene. The police were unable to reach the suspects quickly, despite the impressive amount of evidence. The problem is that in 1989, DNA forensics was still relatively undeveloped, and there were no common genetic databases in existence at the time. The main version of events was presented by Detective Benjamin Caldwell, who was in charge of the case. In his opinion, there could have been more than one attacker, and they must have known the house well. Not only would they have known how to get to the second floor through the backyard in pitch darkness, but they would also have known the layout of the rooms. Looking for witnesses was the next step for the police. They interviewed Fawn's neighbors, friends, and relatives, but all were inconclusive. The detectives had a serious problem ahead. The neighborhood where the house was located was very poor and criminal. There were several criminal gangs operating in the area. It was difficult to bring their members to justice. A month after Fawn's murder, the case is finally moving forward. A certain witness came forward to the police and led them to 3 suspects. This witness knew some important details that the police never released, so his story was taken seriously. The suspects turned out to be 3 teenagers, one of whom was in Fawn's class. They were arrested and questioned, but the boys denied involvement in the murder. When the police searched the home of one of the boys, they found items stolen from the victim's room. This was enough to charge all 3 with murder. But again, the detectives were disappointed. First, the witness suddenly recanted and stopped cooperating with the police. Second, the analysis of DNA, hair, blood, and semen found at the crime scene did not show a clear match with the suspect's samples. At the time, experts had not yet been able to establish an exact match between the samples, and all of the tests produced controversial results. In other words, the analysis could not confirm either a complete match or a guaranteed mismatch. However, the police managed to get some useful information from one of the detainees. In one of the interrogations, he admitted that he and some other guys had indeed broken into Fawn's house that night and stolen some things. He described how he made his way to the second floor through the overhanging roof and even revealed unknown details. According to him, when he threw a tape recorder out the window, the handle fell off. He hid it under a nearby bush, and the police did indeed find it there. But the young man quickly recanted and did not cooperate with the investigation, so his confession could not be used in court. Because of all this, the police had to let the men go and the investigation was once again at a standstill. Most likely, the witnesses were intimidated, but without their testimony in court, the case had almost no chance. All that is known is that one of them spent 8 months in jail for stealing items from Fawn's house. The case has languished ever since. Police did not reopen the investigation until the early 1990s, and the first thing they did was upload DNA samples from the crime scene into the CODIS database. It had been created several years earlier and contained DNA samples from people with criminal records. Unfortunately, no matches were found for Fawn's killer. The creation of this database was the result of a major scientific advance in the study of DNA. It also allowed police to collect DNA samples from the 3 original suspects again and conduct more advanced testing. This time, experts determined conclusively that the hair, semen, and blood did not belong to any of them. This was odd, considering that the suspects were found in possession of Fawn's belongings. Detectives speculated that the 3 men had indeed robbed her house that night, but there was another man with them. He was the one who had abused and killed the girl. This raised even more questions. Could 4 criminals have entered the house unnoticed, killed Fawn, and left the scene unnoticed? The police still had no answer to this question. Since then, the case has once again come to a standstill. With each passing year, the Fawn family believed less and less that this murder would ever be solved. They continued to believe that the 3 suspects were in their home that night and could point to the killer, but they never would. The only thing that could help them discover the truth was the DNA sample stored in the police lab. In 2018, Amber, Fawn's younger sister, shared some disturbing details about the crime. She posted her thoughts and facts, unknown to the police, on a popular American forum dedicated to unsolved crimes. In its 23 years of existence, the forum has developed a very trustworthy reputation, and its members have helped the police solve several high-profile cases. Amber has been verified and confirmed that she is indeed who she says she is, so her message has merit. In her opinion, the perpetrators broke into the house as Fawn's mother and her youngest daughter went to pick her up from her place of work. Their father, who was at home at the time, was asleep. The perpetrators then hid in a closet in an empty room on the second floor and waited for everyone to fall asleep. Amber also said that at least 2 of the perpetrators were personally acquainted with Fawn. One of them studied with her, but the second met the girl in church a few days before the murder. Amber was present at the moment of their meeting, and she was sure that the guy was interested in her sister romantically. She further concluded that the perpetrators had originally planned to kill Fawn, and the robbery was just a contributing factor. The police stuck to the version that the criminals broke into the house for profit and saw the sleeping girl and decided to subject her to violence. But why was Amber so sure that they were preparing to kill? She said it didn't make sense to rob their home. The family was poor and had nothing of value. But even more interesting was the following fact: Amber said that the criminals used her younger sister's nightgown to strangle Fawn, which was lying in the next room. This meant that the attackers had taken it from that room beforehand and were hiding in the closet to strangle the victim. If they hadn't planned the murder beforehand and stumbled upon Fawn during the robbery, it wouldn't make sense for them to take the nightgown from the next room. Amber added that the perpetrators would also have had to know the family's routines to sneak into the house undetected. She herself worked part-time as a nanny Monday through Friday and was only home during the day. On weekends, she slept in the same second-floor room through which the burglars entered. The burglars would have been spotted immediately. They also had to watch the house and wait for the moment when Fawn's mother and younger sister would pick the girl up from work. Despite all this, Amber's story didn't get any closer to solving the case. But it's 2018, and the science of DNA research has taken a leap forward. Dozens, if not hundreds, of long-forgotten cases have been solved thanks to new analytical tools. Fawn's relatives saw all this and resented why the police were in no hurry to reopen the murder investigation. They kept talking to detectives about the case, and each time they got the same answer: extensive testing of DNA samples costs money, and the police have dozens of such cases. So the relatives had to wait for their turn and for the money to come through. But they decided to take the initiative and started a fundraising campaign in 2019. The family wanted to fully cover the cost of the DNA samples and also offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator. Due to the fact that the case was actively covered in the media and the relatives gave numerous interviews, many concerned people responded to the requests for help. The family quickly raised the necessary amount of money, but even here they were disappointed. The police department refused to initiate an investigation at the expense of the victim's relatives. The chief detective explained that in such a situation there is bound to be a big problem if the relatives of a victim can pay for such tests and speed up the results. Then the same right should be available to hundreds of other families who have been searching for years for those responsible for the murder of their loved ones. And it is simply impossible to realize such a thing in practice, because only a few laboratories in the world perform innovative DNA tests, and with such a simultaneous influx of those who want to do so, their resources are simply not enough. The leading company in this field is Parabon Nanolabs. They have made tremendous strides in the study of DNA, from finding a person's relatives through the smallest genetic samples to creating an approximate portrait of the owner of the DNA. It was this lab that would study the samples left in Fawn's bedroom on the night of her murder. The girl's relatives felt that the police were in no hurry to pursue their case. Another reason was that they were a poor family from a bad neighborhood, and murders there were not a priority for investigators. In an interview, Sister Fawn said that if it had been a matter of killing family members of the rich or dignitaries, all the necessary research would have been done immediately. Unfortunately, they were never able to speed up the process, and it wasn't until the end of 2020 that the long-awaited breakthrough came. But the family was not ready to hear the truth. With the financial support of the FBI, the police still sent samples from the Fawn room to the laboratory, where they began a detailed study of the DNA and search for possible relatives of its owner. Mostly they worked with a sample of semen found at the crime scene. In November 2020, they finally managed to reach the person the DNA belonged to. It turned out to be Fawn's cousin, Donald Hawks. Naturally, the news shocked the entire family. At the time of Fawn's death, Donald was 21 years old, and no one had even considered his possible involvement. At the same time, Donald was quite a troubled man and was in and out of jail. He had been convicted of minor offenses such as theft and possession of illegal substances. Unfortunately, DNA samples were not taken from such criminals in those years, otherwise this case would have been solved much sooner. In 2006, Donald died of an overdose, but the police investigated his death because certain circumstances seemed suspicious. Because of this investigation, a sample of his DNA was saved, but it was not entered into the FBI database because the man in this case was the victim, not the perpetrator. As soon as the experts informed the police of their discovery, they compared the sample to the semen found at the crime scene and got a 100% match. Despite the gravity of this discovery, Fawn's relatives had the answer to the question that had haunted them for 31 years. But there was one very important point left in the whole story. A great deal of evidence pointed to the fact that the three original suspects were also at Fawn's house that night. Now it became clear how the perpetrators knew the house and the family's routines so well. Donald was a frequent guest at their house and knew all these nuances. However, the police closed the case and no new charges were filed against the three men. Sister Fawn explained that there was no point in beating a confession out of them. Even though these men were in the house that night, they may not have even witnessed the murder itself. Donald could very well have stayed in the house alone and only attacked Fawn afterwards. Felicia added that the three suspects had already paid for their crime during the time the case remained unsolved. The entire neighborhood was 100% sure of their guilt. Because of this, there was an extremely negative attitude toward them, with all the consequences that entailed. According to Fawn's sister, her life was effectively destroyed. In addition, after the case was closed, it was revealed that the police initially learned about the suspects from the family of one of them. The relatives noticed a Nintendo console among his belongings and remembered that it was the one that had been stolen from Fawn's house. It was mentioned on the news, and everyone in the neighborhood already knew the details. In any case, it is simply impossible to prove her guilt, and the victim's relatives finally know the name of the killer. He lived for 17 years without any punishment for what he had done, and all this time he socialized with his family as if nothing had happened. But eventually his addiction to illegal substances drove him to his grave and he was no longer a threat to anyone. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Kate and Jerry McCann visited the quiet Portuguese resort of Praia da Luz for a 7-day vacation in 2007. It was an obvious choice for a British family with 3 children. With so many British tourists, Portuguese was only the second or third language spoken after English. The locals called the resort Little Britain. The resort also had 3 children's centers and babysitting services. During the time that the playrooms were closed, the couple vacationed with 4 families, 9 adults, each of whom is a medical professional, and 8 children, including the 2-year-old McCann twins and their 3-year-old sister, Madeline. The couple's vacation was rather monotonous. Every day they ate breakfast and lunch with their children in their apartment, and after dinner they sent them to the children's center for entertainment. Every evening, somewhere between 9:30 and 11:30, the adults would go out to eat in a restaurant. The children were left alone in the apartment, occasionally going out to check on them. The restaurant was 50 meters from the apartment, and the McCanns occupied a table for the entire vacation, looking out the windows of their apartment. The bedroom overlooked the parking lot and garden and was next to the back door. It had one window, covered with shutters, facing the parking lot. Madeline's bed was at the other end of the room. The twins slept in cribs and playpens. Madeline slept in one of the cribs with a pink stuffed cat. She was dressed in white and pink short-sleeved pajamas. On May 3rd, at about 9:30 p.m., Kate and Gerald went to the restaurant. They left the sliding and patio doors closed, but did not lock them during dinner. Parents regularly checked to see if their children were okay. The friends they were eating with did the same. At 9:05 p.m., the father went into the children's bedroom. According to him, everything was quiet. Madeline was asleep in her crib. The only thing Jerry was sure of was that he had left the bedroom door closed, and on his second visit it was wide open. Without a second thought, he closed it and went back to the restaurant. Kate wanted to check on the children around 10:30, but Matthew Oldfield, a friend of the McCanns, suggested that they check on their children as well when he went to check on them in a neighboring apartment. Kate agreed. Oldfield made sure everything was quiet in the McCanns' apartment and left. He later admitted that he did not see if Madeline was in her crib at the time. Kate went to check on the children. At 1:00 p.m., she entered the apartment through the patio doors and noticed that the bedroom door was open wider than usual. But when she went to close it, the door slammed shut as if from a draft. She saw that the window was open. The twins were asleep. In Madeline's bed was her stuffed toy. But the girl herself was gone. After searching the apartment and finding no child, Kate Mackin rushed to the restaurant, screaming that her daughter had been kidnapped. Friends of the McCanns who saw them immediately after their daughter's disappearance later recalled, the parents were in deep shock. The girl's mother almost immediately began sobbing loudly and fell into a stupor. Her husband ignored people and looked under every parked car, hoping to find the child. They searched for their daughter until 5 in the morning. Only after repeated pleas did they agree to go to bed. The police were investigating the apartment by then. The Portuguese police acted unprofessionally and made many mistakes during the initial search of the apartment. For example, the investigators did not notify the border guards of the child's disappearance until 24 hours after the start of the investigation. This meant that the local services were deprived of the opportunity to intercept the girl's alleged kidnappers. In addition, the Portuguese law enforcement authorities failed to take fingerprints from the crime scene in a timely manner, failed to set up a cordon around the apartment, and, as a result, failed to prepare sufficient evidence. Half an hour after the girl disappeared, a large-scale search began. Several dozen people were involved. They included staff and guests of the resort. They combed the area for about 6 hours. It was hoped that the girl had simply gone for a walk, interested in something, and would be found soon. By the morning, however, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The Portuguese police questioned the parents, the restaurant staff and friends of the family, and searched the surrounding area. The disappearance of the child had already been reported in the English media. The news was leaked to journalists by friends of the McCanns, who thought it would create a public outcry and make the Portuguese police do a better job. However, the police felt that the publicity could harm the case by reducing the chances of finding the girl. Throughout the investigation, the parents repeatedly accused the police of negligence, unprofessionalism, and a banal unwillingness to look for answers. Perhaps this is why the parents themselves were considered the first prime suspects. This version was first put forward by the Portuguese police 4 months after the girl's disappearance. According to them, Kate and Jerry, who worked as doctors for a long time, accidentally killed their daughter by giving her too much sleeping pills in the hope that she would sleep until they returned. According to police, the parents feared taking responsibility for what they had done and hid the body. They also gave the public and police the impression that Madeline had been kidnapped. They have since allegedly moved the body to a secret location and buried it. This version is based on the reactions of 2 sniffer dogs. One was trained to smell blood and the other to smell decomposition. They were led through the area where the family had been, but the animals only raised their voices inside the Mackins' apartment. One of the dogs smelled the odor of rigor mortis in the car the couple rented 24 days after the girl's disappearance. Hair and tissue from the car and the apartment were also analyzed. The results raised suspicions among Portuguese police. However, investigators later announced that neither the DNA test nor the results of the sniffer dogs were solid proof of the parents' involvement in the case. This was mainly because in 70% of cases the animals confused the odor of a corpse with something else, and the DNA test is too imprecise. Witnesses were found who claimed to have seen a man carrying a sleeping girl in his arms that night. Suspicion fell on a 30-year-old British man, Robert Marat, who lived 3 minutes from the apartment in his mother's house. For several months he was considered the prime suspect, but no evidence could be found against him. Then another tourist showed up and said he was returning to his room that night with his daughter in his arms. After further investigation, it became clear that he was the one the witnesses had mistaken for the kidnapper. Robert Murat was cleared of all charges, and he even managed to sue for damages from the British tabloids that had declared him a criminal. Time passed, but the parents did not give up hope of finding their daughter alive. They contacted and worked with a British PR firm. They tried to maintain public interest in the search. The heartbroken parents met with the U.S. Attorney General, the Pope, and appeared on numerous talk shows. They also set up the Madeleine Foundation, which raised £2 million in less than a year. British investigators worked in parallel with Portuguese investigators, examining evidence and interviewing witnesses, but there were few leads. In 2008, Portuguese police closed the case. In 2011, British Home Secretary Theresa May launched an investigation called Operation Grange. Within its framework, a group of the best British detectives was to solve the mystery of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. A huge amount of money was allocated to the investigation, and British investigators again interviewed dozens of people in Portugal and England. The head of the team, Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, was confident that the possibility of finding the child alive remained. In the course of the operation, they checked all employees of the restaurant who had been convicted of crimes against children, tourists vacationing at the resort, but none of the versions was confirmed. While working on the case, detectives received more than 8,000 messages from people who claimed to have seen Madeleine. Most of the tips came from the US, the UK, Switzerland, Mexico, and Singapore. It is known that the investigation has verified more than 100 such tips, but the information about them is either classified or unconfirmed. Although the story of Madeleine's parents' involvement in her disappearance has been repeatedly rejected by Scotland Yard, it has long been held by Goncalo Amaral, the head of the original Portuguese police investigation. In July 2008, he published a book and subsequent documentary, The Truth About Lies, in which he claimed that the McCanns had faked their daughter's disappearance to cover up her murder. Amaral described the book as a compilation of official evidence, but Madeleine's family called the work an absurd lie. Nevertheless, the book became a bestseller in Portugal, earning the publisher and author more than $1 million, according to some estimates. After the book's release, the investigator gave interviews to various television stations, continuing to blame Madeleine's parents for the incident and claiming that her body was still hidden in Praia da Luz. He later claimed that the parents had allegedly cremated their daughter in a church near the crime scene. At one point, there was a theory that the girl had been kidnapped on behalf of a wealthy family, but investigators say that version is dubious. Madeleine disappeared just 9 days shy of her 4th birthday. At that age, a child remembers relatives and friends well and is unlikely to easily accept strangers as a new family. There was also a version that the girl was an accidental victim of robbers. According to this, the attackers entered the room, but the girl woke up and noticed them. The robbers decided to get rid of her so that she could not identify them. This version seems completely unconvincing for several reasons. First, if the robbers really decided to get rid of the girl, why would they take her out of the room? Also, it is hard to believe that they were so frightened that a small child who saw them in a dark room would be able to remember their faces. According to British journalist Danny Collins, who once worked on Madeleine's story, the child could not have been taken from her bed. It is more likely that she left the apartment in search of her parents and was then abducted by strangers. His theory is supported by the position of the shutters on the windows, which were closed when the police arrived and could only be opened from the inside. No signs of forced entry were found on them or on the front door. According to Collins, this indicated that no burglars or intruders had entered the apartment. The McCanns rejected Collins' version of events, saying that she could not have gone outside on her own. To do so, she would have had to open the front door, walk through the child-proof sliding doors and iron gate, and then close them behind her. The journalist parried by pointing out that the parents did not even know that the shutters in the apartment could not be opened from the outside. Initially, the couple stated that the shutters on the windows were open. If Madeleine did go outside in the absence of her parents, she could have been the victim of several accidents. At the time, workers were repairing drains 180 meters from the McCann home. For this purpose, they dug a trench 182 centimeters deep and 120 centimeters wide. The girl could fall into this hole and lose consciousness, and the next day, when the tunnel was dug, she could simply not be noticed. This version was denied by the responsible foreman, who said that his men and the police were checking the trench. The British politician and writer Clement Freud, grandson of Sigmund Freud, was even considered a suspect. He was friends with the McCann family and also had a house in Praia da Luz. The man himself died in 2009, and in 2016 several girls accused him of molesting minors. No evidence was found to support this theory, so it was pretty much dropped. There is a version that the girl was kidnapped and sold into slavery. Initially, the witnesses included two men who were seen near the hotel. They could be members of an international gang that kidnaps children on behalf of influential perverts. The criminals are said to have extensive connections, including with the Portuguese police. This would explain why the latter sabotaged the investigation and put forward hypotheses as far from the truth as possible. In 2015, the number of active investigators on the Madeleine case dropped from 28 to 4, and by 2017, British authorities had spent a total of more than $19 million on the investigation. The public repeatedly rebuked the government for spending so much on a case whose chances of being solved diminished with each passing year. At the time, it seemed that there was little chance of finding answers, but everyone was wrong. In 2020, the case was handled not only by investigators from Portugal and England, but also from Germany. It was the latter who, 13 years after the disappearance of the girl, made a sensational statement the probable perpetrator is known. At first, his name was not revealed so as not to harm the investigation, but in the summer of 2020, the German police revealed the truth. The main suspect is German Christian Bruckner, previously convicted of child abuse. Along with this, the investigators voiced in the most disappointing version most likely, the girl is no longer alive. In May 2007, the day before he disappeared, Madeleine Bruckner told one of his former girlfriends that he had a job in Praia da Luz for tomorrow. He called the job terrible, but said he had to do it. 3 years later, another friend of his joked that Bruckner looked like one of the sketches of a possible kidnapper of the little girl, and even asked him if he had kidnapped the child. This time, the man did not give a direct answer, just a shrug. Prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters, who is leading the investigation, said police had discovered another important detail. The suspect had discussed the girl's abduction in a conversation with another sadistic man on the internet. According to the prosecutor, Bruckner kidnapped, abused and killed the girl. Moreover, he believes this is far from the man's only such crime. At the time Bruckner was named the prime suspect, he was serving a prison sentence for abusing a 72-year-old American woman in Portugal. German investigators quickly began looking into Bruckner's involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. They dug through 2 plots of land owned by the man, and in both cases they expected to make a high-profile discovery. Under one of the lots, they found a certain basement that the newspapers called a secret room. Law enforcement has not revealed what they found, but they are positioning the discovery as an extremely strong lead. At the second site, they found a buried box of videotapes, the contents of which are also undisclosed. Apparently, it contains gruesome footage of Bruckner's other victims. But not Madeleine. Bruckner himself has not responded in any way to the accusation that he abducted the girl. All we know is that the man was moved to solitary confinement immediately after his name was released to protect him from other inmates. In the end, there is still a chance that he will confess to what he did and ease the suffering of the parents who have been searching for an answer for 14 years. Even if that doesn't happen and the police don't find hard evidence. Overwhelmingly, investigators are convinced that Bruckner is the one involved in this high-profile case. The emergence of a prime suspect has renewed public interest in the disappearance of 14 years ago. It may be well-funded again. If Madeleine is alive, she would have turned 20 on May 12, 2023. Her parents still believe their daughter is out there somewhere, but have been less active in recent years, devoting more time to their other 2 children. Still, the girl's mother buys her presents for every holiday, and she believes that one day Madeleine will see her home again. Share your opinion on this story in the comments.
Jennifer Bastian was born in Chicago on April 15, 1973. From the beginning, the girl had everything a child could want: parents who loved her and a big sister to whom she was very close. One day, her family chose to begin a fresh start and relocate to Tacoma, a city close to Seattle. Jennifer has loved sports since she was young. She loved playing soccer and practicing gymnastics. She always strived for excellence in these sports. However, Jennifer was not limited to just that. Playing the piano also had a special place in her life. Jennifer's parents were always supportive of her aspirations. When her father gifted her a new bike at age 13, she did not just ride around the city streets on it. Jennifer decided to aim higher, becoming a successful cyclist. When she learned about an upcoming cycling event on San Juan Island, she decided to participate. This was a serious competition that needed a lot of effort and dedication. The location of San Juan Island, near the Canadian border, added a special charm to the event. Jennifer started to train hard. Almost every day she rode her bike for over 6 miles. Her friend joined her in the challenge and they trained together, helping each other achieve their objective. The girl lived near a big park that had an 8-kilometer circular road. She and her friend would practice there on Mondays. August 4, 1986 was a frightening day for Jennifer. She spent the morning with her mother, but after lunch, her mom went to work the evening shift. Jennifer had planned to go to the park with a friend, but her friend canceled at the last minute because of some essential business. Despite being alone, Jennifer decided to go to the park for her exercise routine. She asked her father for permission to go alone. Her dad agreed, but with the strict requirement to be back by 7:30 p.m. Jennifer left a note for her mom and departed around 3:30 p.m. However, when her dad got home about 8:30 p.m., he discovered that his daughter had vanished. He scoured the entire house and peered outside, expecting to find her bike in the garage, but Jennifer was gone. In despair, he phoned his wife, who hastily rushed home. They immediately contacted the police and a large search for Jennifer began. The officers searched every corner of the park, despite its vast size and dense woods. With night approaching, the search became even harder and more puzzling. Police officers worked hard in the area where Jennifer was supposed to have driven on an 8-mile road. Local volunteers quickly joined the search as everyone in the park area knew each other and were willing to help. Officers canvassed park visitors, urged anyone who might have witnessed Jennifer to report to them, and located the first witnesses relatively quickly. 3 boys who attended the girls' school reported seeing her driving through the ring road around 4:10 p.m. They mentioned the presence of a man on a bicycle in the area and provided a brief description of him. However, Tacoma Park is frequently visited by bicyclists, joggers, and other recreation enthusiasts, so the police are hesitant to draw conclusions about the man's potential role in Jennifer's disappearance. A few more people came forward to say they saw Jennifer near the park around 3:00 in the afternoon. Jennifer stopped there to refill her water bottle and take off her helmet. These people even talked to her for a bit, and Jennifer shared her plans for an upcoming cycling competition. Sadly, their search for Jennifer was unsuccessful until late in the evening, and they still haven't found any clues about her whereabouts. The courageous officers searched the park throughout the night but repeatedly came up empty-handed. A thick fog covered the scene as nightfall approached. The police came to her mother's house and advised her to wait for her daughter. They brought dogs trained to find missing persons and requested some of the girl's possessions to help the dogs detect her scent. Thus, the police officers decided to close the park to the public for the next 3 days. This ensures that they can carry out detailed investigations in the area without any hindrances. Several hundred volunteers stepped up to assist the officers, indicating how eager the community is in finding Jennifer. But there was a scarier part to the story than one would think. A few months ago, in a different park, another girl had died under strange circumstances. This caused the residents of the peaceful town to speculate about a serial killer being present. It was March 26th of that year, only 5 months before Jennifer went missing, when 12-year-old Michaela Welch visited Puget Park with her younger siblings. All 3 girls had piano lessons coming up in just a few hours. Michaela wanted to ask her mother at work if they could spend some time playing in the park. Michaela has always been remarkably self-sufficient despite her young age. She had been responsible for looking after her younger sisters since she was a child, while their mom was at her job. Their mother trusted them and permitted them to go to the park for a while. The 3 sisters went to the park, without knowing that they could also be involved in this eerie mystery. Michaela and one of her sisters rode bicycles while the 3rd girl rode a skateboard. They realized they forgot to bring a snack with them, and they had to go to class after the ride. No one wanted to go hungry, so Michaela decided to run home and make something to eat while her sisters stayed in the playground. There were many kids and grown-ups in the area, so the older sister wasn't concerned about their well-being, especially since they lived only a short bike ride away. While Michaela was at home, her siblings needed to use the restroom, as there were no public restrooms in the park. They walked to a coffee shop across the street from the park. When they came back around 1:15 p.m., they spotted the meal that Michaela had made on the table along with her bike next to it. But the girl was missing. The sisters searched and called her name, but Michaela did not appear. The sisters were frightened, and they sought help from adults. The police were contacted, and they started searching the park while asking witnesses for information. One witness, a 13-year-old, reported seeing a doubtful man hanging around under the bridge near the park and following Michaela and her sisters. The boy gave a basic description of the man, from which a draft was made. Another person who saw what happened was a man who worked at the school where the girl who was harmed attended. Fate brought him to the scene when he was passing by a nearby park. He saw little Michaela talking to an unfamiliar person, which made him anxious. He bravely shared his observation with the police officers, and everyone was surprised by what he said. The way he described the stranger completely contradicted what the 13-year-old had told them. They thought they were looking for different people, even down to how they dressed. The investigation was muddled by rumors, but the officers persisted in their all-day search until they finally found the girl's body in a part of the park that was overgrown. This was the grim end to a night that started with mild fear. The body was in a deep hole that seemed to have been used for a fire at some point in the past. The cops looked straight at her neck and saw that it had multiple stab wounds. Her body was covered in scrapes too, and it was clear the girl had been through immense pain. Later on, medical professionals confirmed that she was brutally mistreated, and the offender's genetic material was gathered. But back in 1986, DNA databases didn't exist. The professionals were powerless as they attempted to isolate a DNA profile from a semen sample. There was not much hope, so they put this evidence away, to wait for better technology. It quickly became clear that no other evidence would be uncovered in this confusing case. The investigation was left with just the possibility of a miracle and the determination to solve this difficult mystery. The investigation remained stagnant for a while, frozen in time. The police kept questioning everyone who could have witnessed something. However, no clues revealed a definite solution. After months of waiting, a witness approached the officers with fresh information. He described a man he had seen in a different park. This guy looked like the drawing on the detective's table. That was a crucial moment. Maybe the murderer had switched targets and was now searching for a new prey. The next several months were extremely nerve-wracking. The city was overcome with fear, and each day was a genuine test for the inhabitants. And then, just like the witness had warned, Jennifer disappeared into the park. This was devastating for the city and confirmed the existence of a serial killer. Michaela's murder and Jennifer's disappearance had clear similarities. The girls were around the same age, riding bicycles in parks located in the same neighborhood, only 6 kilometers apart. Investigators and Jennifer's family hoped that it was merely a coincidence and that Jennifer could be found alive. However, as the days passed, their hopes faded. Detectives understood that it was most likely that she remained a victim of the same killer who murdered Michaela. They searched the park thoroughly for her. Despite everyone's efforts, including the police and volunteers, the girl was not found over the following weeks. After Jennifer had been missing for 24 days, her mother decided to repaint the walls in their house to distract herself from the overwhelming and distressing thoughts. Simultaneously, a detective visited her and shared the heartbreaking news that the girl's body had been discovered in the nearby park, not too far from the path she was riding. A man out jogging along the path discovered her when he caught a strong whiff of a decomposing body. He quickly notified the police. The girl's body was concealed under debris and leaves amidst the trees. The police suspect that the perpetrator deliberately arranged the spot beforehand, requiring a considerable amount of time. Her bike was found a few yards away, also camouflaged by branches. Medical professionals found out that strangulation and physical assault led to the victim's death. Although there were no biological traces of the culprit found in the autopsy, this only confirmed the police's suspicion that they were dealing with a serial killer. This occurred even though there was not enough concrete evidence available at the time, and DNA analysis was not yet common. Detectives focused on finding a suspect who could attack at any moment, devoting all their efforts to the task. They searched the archives for previous crimes committed in Tacoma and came across a case from 1970, when a 13-year-old girl vanished. Her body was found 3 months later in the woods, and the investigation revealed that a 29-year-old man named David Fisher, who worked at an animal store, killed her. One day, Fisher mentioned receiving monkeys to train and invited the girl to help. The girl often visited and trusted Fisher over time because she loved animals. One day, Fisher mentioned receiving monkeys to train and invited the girl to help. One day, Fisher mentioned receiving monkeys to train and invited the girl to help. She agreed, and he took advantage of her, ultimately killing her and burying her body in the woods. He got caught and went to jail, but then got sent to a less strict facility for good conduct after 3 years. The place was more like a farm than a prison and didn't even have a fence, so the inmates could almost move around freely. Fisher decided to escape, and the police have been unable to find him since. After Michaela and Jennifer were murdered, people speculated that Fisher might have been involved because his tactics and victims closely resembled his previous crimes. Psychologists who had treated Fisher even cautioned that he might kill again. However, 16 years went by and Fisher was never apprehended. Detectives later realized that he may have fled to a far-off location. Police officers investigated everyone who might have been involved and spent hours analyzing thousands of leads. However, the investigation made no progress. A few years later, police decided to check the DNA sample found on Michaela's body against databases. Unfortunately, no match was found. This continued until 2011, when the Tacoma Police Department formed the Unsolved Crimes Unit. The detective in charge searched for staff and discovered Lindsay Wade, a highly accomplished, long-serving police officer. Wade was asked to join the Unsolved Cases Division and she accepted right away. The woman visited the places where the crimes occurred, read every report again, and looked at all the proof. She decided to collect every man connected to the case, no matter how small their involvement. The list contained all the individuals who had seen what happened and those that had been in the park on the day of the murder. It also included people who had shared information with the police or called them, as well as other lawbreakers in Tacoma. Lindsay spent several months on the process and ended up with a list of 200-300 names. However, it was difficult to identify a killer from such a large pool of suspects. Consequently, she opted for a different approach and sent all the evidence back to the lab. In 1986, specialists only examined Jennifer's body because technology at the time couldn't detect tiny evidence. Additionally, DNA analysis wasn't used in investigations back then, so such research appeared pointless. However, things are different now. Specialists chose to study the swimsuit that Jennifer wore on that tragic day. Traces of male semen were discovered on this swimsuit. The specialists obtained a DNA sample and, surprisingly, the outcome did not match the sample retrieved from Michaela. The detectives could not foresee this development. They assumed the same person was responsible for Jennifer and Michaela's murders. The victims' families were also shocked by this revelation, and the detectives were now tasked with the daunting challenge of identifying both murderers. The lab quickly added Jennifer's swimsuit DNA to the database, but there were no matches. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the grim investigation. Nevertheless, Lindsay didn't give up hope. She reached out to one of the top experts in DNA research, Kaylin Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick was a genetic genealogist, and Lindsay requested her assistance with the case. Genetic genealogy entails identifying an individual's DNA based on their relatives, using every available DNA database. With advancements in science, even the most remote familial connections can be uncovered. By getting closer and closer to the owner of the DNA, the specialists might discover several thousand relatives. Then, they must examine each of them and establish familial connections to pinpoint the individual in question. Kaylin took the case and provided a list of possible distant relatives of the owner of the DNA. But that didn't help the detectives much. They investigated the people on the list, but came no closer to catching the killers. The experts were also unable to find any closer relatives of the criminals in the available databases. Lindsay also contacted Parabon, a company known for creating approximate portraits of people based on their DNA. Although the results of their work are not always accurate, they often manage to reflect similar people in the images. The company gave the detective photos of the people with DNA, which were later released to ask for help in finding them. The police got many leads, but they all led nowhere. Lindsay went back to her list of 200-300 men and tried to remove the ones who seemed less likely to be connected to the murders. With only 160 names left from Lindsay's efforts, she aimed to gather DNA from all of them. However, due to the 30-year gap since the murders, most of these individuals have relocated to diverse places, making this a challenging task. The scientists undertook tedious work and were eventually successful in achieving their goal. It's surprising that all participants willingly agreed to provide their DNA samples. However, the subsequent analysis was delayed for a year due to the police labs being overwhelmed with other cases. Lindsay retired in 2018, but before departing, she sent the final 18 samples to the lab. The investigation was then passed on to a new detective who awaited the outcomes. 25 days later, the new detective called her and told her that the semen found on Jennifer's swimsuit matched the DNA of one of the last 18 people selected from Lindsay's list. The news that 60-year-old Robert Washburn was the killer shocked Lindsay, who was familiar with his name. The police had taken interest in him well before Jennifer's murder because he had passed along information about a man resembling Michaela's killer. This happened 2 months before Jennifer's tragic death, in the same park that Robert showed to the police. As it later emerged, this is also where Jennifer was murdered. The detectives were taken aback by this revelation. They didn't know why Robert would provide this information since he had no connection to Michaela's murder. If it wasn't for this event, the man wouldn't have been in the police reports and no one would have asked for his DNA. It's worth mentioning that Robert gave the sample voluntarily, which helped prove his guilt. Before 1986, Washburn had no criminal record and he lived close to Jennifer's place of residence and work at Boeing afterwards. He got married a few years after the murder, and he and his wife had a daughter who needed constant care due to serious health issues. After his divorce, Robert assumed the full-time care of his daughter and they relocated to a small town in another state. He stopped working to focus solely on her well-being. The discovery of DNA evidence on Jennifer's clothing linked Robert to the crime, resulting in his arrest and extradition to Washington state. Everyone who knew Robert was stunned by the authorities' decision. He was a great father who spent his whole life caring for his daughter. Even his ex-wife confirms he was never violent and remained calm and composed. At the questioning, he was extremely nervous. At the beginning, he didn't know what he was being accused of, and only later asked, "Is it because of the sample I gave a year ago?" "I didn't murder that girl," Robert stated. To the investigators, it appeared as a sign of his guilt, although they already had enough evidence without a confession. As a matter of fact, his DNA matched a sample from the victim's clothes. Robert had a very low chance of winning at trial. However, his immediate denial of guilt, even before he was informed of the reasons for his arrest, revealed a lot. He persisted in his denial, but later on, he accepted a plea bargain. Robert admitted to a horrible crime: he murdered Jennifer. He claims that on that fateful day, he came across Jennifer walking down the road. He then stopped her, pulled her by the arm, and took her to the woods where he killed her and concealed the body. Strangely, he did not admit to assaulting her. At the same time, the DNA discovered on her clothing strongly indicated that he was involved in this terrible tragedy. The January 2019 agreement sentenced him to 26.5 years in jail, with parole optional after 20 years. Due to Robert's age, he may stay imprisoned for life. But the investigation didn't stop there for 3 decades. They thought there was only one murderer of Michaela and Jennifer. But this wasn't the truth. Nevertheless, the detectives were committed to solving Michaela's homicide since the cases were linked. In 2018, investigators asked Parabon for help in using genetic genealogy to investigate a DNA sample. The technology had advanced in recent years. It took several months of hard work to track down the person's family connections. Finally, experts discovered a family that had 2 brothers living in Tacoma when Michaela was murdered. The investigators faced the challenge of obtaining DNA samples from both brothers. They started closely following both brothers, and the elder brother, Gary Hartman, who is 66 years old, became the primary focus. The police followed him to the hospital where he worked as a nurse. Then, he went to a nearby cafe with his colleagues. During lunch, the man wiped his mouth with a napkin several times. The police took the napkin away. The evidence was sent to the lab immediately after the man left. Detectives received the long-awaited result soon after. Hartman's DNA matched the semen found on Michaela's body. Gary was eventually arrested 40 days after Robert's arrest. And 32 years after Michaela's death, just like in Robert's situation, all of his friends and family were stunned. Harry had never committed any crime. He and his third spouse lived a seemingly average domestic life, and appeared to be a rather good person. Despite all the circumstances, Harry maintained his innocence when he found himself in the midst of a criminal case. The trial started in 2022, but ended quickly due to modern DNA testing that proved Harry's guilt. When the prosecutor declared the verdict, Harry couldn't control his emotions. Crying and begging for forgiveness in front of Michaela's family was heard in court, but it didn't prevent the man from receiving punishment. The court emphasized the severity of the crime, and he was sentenced to 26.5 years in prison, just like Robert. At the trial, Gary was 70 years old and needed a walker to move around the courtroom. Two well-known cases that had been linked for 30 years came to a close. People who followed the investigation were troubled by the fact that two killers who had similar handwriting had surfaced in the same neighborhood almost simultaneously. Despite this, both were eventually apprehended, tried, and held responsible for their actions. Share your opinion on this story in the comments.
Tara Grinstead was born in 1974 in Hawkinsville, USA. During her school years, she took part in beauty contests and often won. Tara aimed to receive a good education, so she saved the money earned from the contests to pay for tuition. After college, Tara received a master's degree in education and achieved her long-desired job. She became a high school history teacher in Ocilla, Georgia. The town of Ocilla had fewer than 4,000 residents who were mostly acquainted with each other. The town's atmosphere was peaceful and laid back. The locals believed that serious crime could never happen in Ocilla. Tara worked at Ocilla School for a while and had a great relationship with staff and students. She was friendly and always willing to assist. In October 2005, her pupils were getting ready for a local beauty pageant and she provided invaluable help. As their instructor had often won prizes in similar events before, the girls were thrilled to have her support. On October 22nd, Tara assisted the students in finalizing their preparations for the pageant. Later, she went on a picnic with her school friends and arrived back home at 11 p.m. She parked her truck outside under an awning. Since then, Tara has not communicated with anyone. Her mother, who resides in a different city, was the most concerned as her daughter typically answered the phone, but there has been no response this time. On Monday, October 24th, Tara didn't come to work, which caused a lot of worry. This was out of character for her since she was very dedicated to her job. She would have let her superiors know if she needed time off. Tara's friends contacted Police Chief Billy Hancock to check if she was okay. At 10 a.m., he went to her home and assumed that her phone was dead and she was either sick or overslept. When he got to Tara's house, he saw her car where it usually was. The doors were open, but this didn't surprise Billy because residents in small towns don't fret about theft. Billy then spotted an envelope containing $100 in cash on the dashboard. This was odd. How could a conscientious person like Tara leave money in a noticeable location? Billy knocked on the door, but nobody answered. So, he looked around the house. At first, everything seemed fine, with no signs of a struggle or forced entry. However, in Tara's room, the detectives discovered a huge mess that was very unusual for a woman. Her things were scattered on the floor, including the clothes she was last seen wearing. Her phone was on the nightstand, charging. It appeared as though Tara had left the house for a while, but her whereabouts were unknown. On the ground outside the house, the police officers found the first piece of evidence that led them to think of a possible crime. There was a latex glove lying around that could have been used to cover fingerprints. Since then, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the state equivalent of the FBI, has become involved. The main version of the investigation was kidnapping. There was very little evidence. Besides the glove, the detectives found only two questionable things. Tara's broken necklace was on the bedroom floor, and her alarm clock was not in its usual place. None of this helped the detectives solve the mystery of her disappearance. That Monday was a truly terrible day for the small town. The police cordoned off Tara's house and the school held an assembly. Tara's staff and students did their best to help with the search. They formed a group of volunteers, printed up a stack of flyers with a picture of the woman and information about her disappearance, and in the next few hours these papers were posted all over town. That day, the volunteers stayed home until 100 a.m. The Bureau of Investigation contacted the woman's neighbors. The Bureau of Investigation contacted Tara's neighbors and searched the area where she lived. The search included sniffer dogs that were brought in hopes of picking up the trail of missing persons. Investigators still held out hope that Tara had simply gone somewhere on foot and the dogs would easily find her. At the same time, the latex glove was given to experts whose goal was to collect as much data as possible. They managed to take a DNA sample, but no matches were found, only that the sample belonged to a man. None of this yielded any results. It was as if Tara had vanished from her own home. It is often the case that when a woman disappears, someone in her inner circle is to blame. After investigating the men Tara was involved with, detectives couldn't find a single suspect. Her longest relationship was with Marcus Harper, a former police officer and military man. The couple broke up at Tara's request about a year before her disappearance. The reason for the breakup was that the woman wanted to start a family and Marcus was not ready for that. After the breakup, they maintained friendly relations, calling and corresponding. Later, the detectives discovered an interesting detail. Marcus had come to Ocilla 3 weeks before Tara's disappearance, but he had not told her. When the woman learned of Marcus's arrival from mutual acquaintances, she became very upset. She called him repeatedly, trying to find out why he had not informed her of his arrival. Soon, Tara's condition became hysterical. Her relatives were very worried and even wondered if Tara might do something reckless. However, the girl soon came to her senses and the police did not consider Marcus a suspect. The couple had been together for a long time, but their relationship had ended. And the detectives could not find the motives for the crime, but soon they were waiting for an interesting twist. Police learned that Tara had been threatened by her former student. March 30, 2005. 7 months before the woman's disappearance, he came to her house and was extremely aggressive. When Tara refused to let him in, the boy began to break down the door and the neighbors had to call the police. It turned out that the young man had been in love with the teacher since high school. According to her acquaintances, the former student was emotionally unstable, acting strangely and even scary. For some time, Tara tried to help him sort out his problems, but his mental state only worsened. After this incident, when the young man tried to break into her house, she wrote a report on him. She was very afraid that he would harm her. After Tara disappeared, the police tracked down this young man. He was working in a neighboring town 150 kilometers from Ocilla. The boy gave detectives an alibi for the night his former teacher disappeared. His involvement in the case could not be established. A business card of a certain police officer was also found in the woman's house. It turned out that Tara had been seeing him for some time, but he was living in another city at the time of her disappearance. The policeman also provided an alibi for the night of Tara's disappearance. This effectively ended the list of possible suspects. With no clues in hand, the police decided to organize a search for the woman 2 weeks after her disappearance. Such a late decision seemed strange, since it was clear from the first minutes that Tara had not left home of her own free will. The search involved hundreds of volunteers who combed the neighborhoods of Ocilla, went through the woods, studied ditches and rivers, but they failed to find a single trace of Tara. During the search, it was reported that a house and a car had burned down near Tara's home. The locals almost unanimously agreed that the incident had something to do with the woman's disappearance. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to cover his tracks, or perhaps the people were so shocked and frightened that everything seemed suspicious. Whatever the case, the search was fruitless, and the police were faced with the grim reality that there were simply no leads left. The next few years brought the police no closer to solving the mystery. It wasn't until 2009 that an event occurred that brought the missing Tara Grinstead back into the spotlight. A certain user created a YouTube channel and posted an extremely eerie video. A man sat in the frame, his face obscured and his voice altered. In the video, he stated that he was involved in the disappearance of 16 girls and named them. Among them was Tara Grinstead. The unidentified man added that he had hidden the bodies safely and that in new videos he would give clues as to the location of the graves. Police immediately checked the video and found that all 16 names belonged to the missing women. The FBI quickly tracked down the author of the video. He turned out to be 27-year-old Andrew Haley. After his arrest, he claimed he was only joking. The police were unable to link Andrew to any of the 16 missing girls, but still managed to avoid court. For giving false testimony and tampering with evidence, the man was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, suspended for 13 years. The hope of solving this mysterious case vanished and the police were once again left without a single lead. In December 2010, Tara Grinstead was officially declared dead, as there was simply nothing to work with. As the years passed, the people of Ocilla remembered Tara Grinstead's disappearance well, but less and less. Conversations about Tara remained behind closed doors. The subject was rarely brought up in everyday life. The town had changed forever. Fear and suspicion permeated the locals for years to come. It wasn't until 2016 that something happened to get people talking about Tara again. Atlanta journalist Bain Lindsay created his own mystery podcast, and for the first episode, he tackled the case of Tara Grinstead. He and his colleague traveled to Ocilla, where he met with private investigator Maurice Godwin. Together, they began working the case from the ground up, literally. They had no access to police records, so their only source of information was the people of the town. At first, they could only communicate with Tara's friends and relatives. Outsiders avoided talking about the missing girl, but that didn't last long, and Lindsay's enthusiasm managed to revive interest in the case, and soon the people of Ocilla began to discuss it again.
Lindsay and Maurice worked through all the possible leads. They considered 3 possible suspects: Tara's ex-boyfriends and the student who tried to break into her house. Along the way, they talked to anyone who might have useful information. They were so engrossed in the case that several times they thought the clue was literally one step away.
One day, Lindsay received a phone call in which an unknown person offered to search the grounds of Tara's house for remains. The police did, and at one point they found bones. Experts quickly determined that the bones belonged to an animal. Despite the excitement and the new wave of interest in the case, no serious progress was made. Or rather, they failed to solve the case directly during the creation of the podcast. But it was this amateur investigation that was crucial to the long-awaited truth about Tara's disappearance. In early 2017, a Brooke Sheridan came to the police department. Her story shocked detectives who no longer believed the truth would ever come out. Brooke told investigators that her ex-boyfriend, Bo Dukes, once confessed to her that he had helped his friend dispose of Tara Grinstead's body. After learning of this, the girl repeatedly begged the man to confess, but he remained silent. After hearing Brooke's story, the police were in no hurry. The detectives decided to play it safe and asked Brooke to wear a wire and go to Dukes to extract a confession. It worked. The man didn't deny his involvement, and the police had probable cause to arrest him. To their surprise, Dukes immediately cooperated with the investigation and confessed to everything. Late that night, he received a call from his friend and former classmate Ryan Duke. He asked to borrow a truck and to help him with something, after which he added, "I broke into Tara Grinstead's house to steal some money, but something didn't go according to plan and I killed her." According to Ryan's story, after a party with friends, he went for a drive. That's when he decided to break into someone's house and steal money, and his choice fell on Tara's house. He was under the influence of illegal substances at the time. After opening the door with a credit card, he entered the house and started looking for money. Tara spotted him and a struggle ensued, with only Ryan coming out alive. When Dukes arrived at Tara's house in a truck, they loaded the woman's body into it and drove her into the woods. The two then proceeded to dispose of the body over the course of several days. The story shocked the people of Ocilla. Dukes and Duke were never considered suspects because they simply had no motive. Nor were there any clues linking the two boys to the woman's disappearance. Despite his full confession, Bo Dukes did not testify against himself at trial. At the trial, he spoke to Tara's family, crying and apologizing for his actions. Dukes spent a long time in the military, was a veteran, and had many commendations, but the court sentenced him to 25 years in prison for helping to cover up the crime. As for Ryan Duke, his trial has dragged on to this day. This is largely due to the lawyers using various loopholes to delay the inevitable. There is no doubt that Ryan is going to prison. Now that the truth about this high-profile case has come out, her mother has confessed that all these years she secretly hoped for a miracle that her daughter would return to her alive. Unfortunately, reality proved to be cruel, senseless, and devoid of miracles. At least now the whole world knows exactly what happened in that small town in 2005. Share your opinion on this story in the comments.